The year was 323 BC. In the opulent, fever-dream city of Babylon, a man who was also a god lay dying. He was not merely a king, he was the architect of an age, the conqueror of the known world, a force of nature who had bent civilizations to his will. Yet, in the sweltering Mesopotamian heat, within the gilded walls of Nebuchadnezzar II's palace, Alexander the Great, the indomitable, the invincible, was being conquered by an enemy he could not see, a foe that defied his legendary military genius. His body, a vessel of divine ambition, was betraying him in the most grotesque and agonizing fashion. The air, thick with the scent of incense and decay, hung heavy with a question that would echo through millennia. What or who was killing the master of the world? And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. To comprehend the magnitude of the horror unfolding in that Babylonian palace, one must first grasp the sheer scale of the world Alexander had forged. This was not merely a kingdom, it was a concept, a breathtaking tapestry of conquest stitched together by the relentless march of the Macedonian phalanx. From the shores of the Adriatic to the dusty plains of India, from the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, an empire had been born from the singular vision of one man. He was the son of Philip II of Macedon, a brilliant, brutal, one-eyed king who had unified the fractious Greek city-states through a masterful blend of diplomacy and force, creating the military machine that his son would unleash upon the world. But Alexander was more than his father's heir. He was a student of Aristotle, a mind steeped in the grandeur of Hellenic philosophy and the epic tales of Homer. He saw himself as a new Achilles, destined for glory, fated to live a short but brilliant life that would forever be enshrined in legend. When he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor at the age of 22, he was not just initiating a war of revenge against the Persian Empire for its past transgressions against Greece. He was embarking on a divine mission, a quest to merge West and East into a single, universal culture. The Persian Achaemenid Empire, the superpower of its day, had seemed an insurmountable behemoth, a sprawling dominion that had endured for over 2 centuries. Yet, in a whirlwind campaign that remains one of history's most astonishing military achievements, Alexander shattered its power. At the Battle of the Granicus, he led a death-defying cavalry charge across a river and up a muddy bank to smash the Persian satraps. At Issus, he faced Darius III himself, the King of Kings, and sent him fleeing in panic, capturing his family in the process. The decisive blow came at Gaugamela, where, against overwhelming odds, Alexander's tactical genius turned the tide, irrevocably breaking Persian might and opening the heart of the empire to his armies. He marched into Babylon not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, a successor to the ancient kings. He was crowned pharaoh in Egypt, where he founded the first and most famous of his many cities, Alexandria. He pushed ever eastward, driven by an insatiable curiosity and an unquenchable thirst for glory, a concept the Greeks called pathos. He led his men through the treacherous passes of Afghanistan, founded cities in modern-day Tajikistan, and married Roxana, the daughter of a Sogdian nobleman, in a strategic union meant to bind his new subjects to his rule. He crossed the Indus River, defeated the Indian king Porus and his war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes, and only turned back when his own weary, homesick troops finally refused to go any further, to march to the very edge of the world. His return journey was an odyssey of suffering, a brutal trek through the Gedrosian desert that cost the lives of thousands, a testament to both his recklessness and his willingness to share the hardships of his men. By the time he returned to the heart of his empire, to Babylon, he was not just a king. He was Alexander III of Macedon, hegemon of the Hellenic League, Shahanshah of Persia, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia. He was a living legend, a figure of such staggering power and influence that many, including perhaps himself, believed he had transcended mortal limits and ascended to divinity. His ambition was now turning to the administration of this vast multicultural domain. He planned new expeditions, a circumnavigation of Africa, the conquest of Arabia. He envisioned a world where Greek colonists and Persian nobles would intermarry, where cultures would blend, where trade would flow freely along new routes. He sat at the center of this world, a sun king whose light illuminated everything. But in that suffocating Babylonian summer, a shadow began to fall, a creeping internal darkness that no army could defeat and no ambition could outrun. The world held its breath, for the fate of the world itself rested on the fading breaths of its master. The beginning of the end was, like so many moments in Alexander's life, steeped in revelry and excess. The year 323 BC had been one of frantic activity and grand designs. Alexander was grappling with the immense challenge of governing his conquered territories, a task perhaps more daunting than the conquests themselves. He was dealing with unruly satraps, integrating 30,000 young Persian nobles, the epigoni, into his Macedonian army, and planning his next great military venture into Arabia. His court in Babylon was a dizzying cosmopolitan hub, a melting pot of Greek soldiers, Persian courtiers, Babylonian astronomers, and envoys from the farthest corners of his empire. The city itself was a testament to his vision of a fused culture, a place where Macedonian ruggedness met Oriental opulence. But it was also a place of simmering tensions. His Macedonian veterans, the men who had bled for him from Thebes to the Indus, were growing resentful of his policy of fusion, his adoption of Persian dress and court customs, his elevation of Persian nobles to positions of authority. They saw it as a betrayal of their shared heritage, a dilution of the very culture they had fought to spread. This discontent had already boiled over into a near mutiny at Opus, where Alexander's emotional, tearful speech had barely managed to quell the uprising, reaffirming the deep, complex bond he shared with his men. Yet, the undercurrent of mistrust remained. It was in this charged atmosphere that Alexander attended a series of lavish drinking parties. The first was a banquet hosted by his friend and admiral, Nearchus, a celebration of a successful voyage. Alexander, ever the competitor, drank heavily, as was the Macedonian custom. Following this, he was invited to a private, more intimate gathering by his close companion, Medius of Larissa. It was here, according to the ancient accounts, that the first blow was struck. After draining a large cup of unmixed wine in honor of Heraclesa, feat of legendary consumption, Alexander was said to have cried out suddenly, a sharp, piercing shriek of agony, as if he had been struck by a spear. He was immediately overcome by a debilitating weakness and had to be helped to his chambers. The vibrant, indefatigable conqueror, who had shrugged off grievous battle wounds, who had led his men from the front in every engagement, was suddenly laid low. The initial diagnosis, if one could call it that, was likely a simple case of overindulgence, a severe hangover from which the king would surely recover. But he did not. The following day, a fever took hold, the first sign that this was no ordinary ailment. It was a persistent, malevolent heat that clung to him, sapping his legendary strength. He tried to fight it, to continue his duties. He was moved to a cooler location, near the great swimming pool of the palace, where he continued to meet with his generals, giving orders for the upcoming Arabian campaign, his mind still fixed on the future, on the next horizon to be conquered. But the fever was relentless. Day after day, it intensified, a slow-burning fire that was consuming him from within. The pain in his abdomen, which had begun with that first sharp cry, became a constant, gnawing presence. He grew weaker, his body slick with a perpetual sweat that soaked his linens. The man who had marched thousands of miles on foot, who had endured the extremes of climate and terrain, soon found himself unable to walk. He had to be carried on a litter to perform the daily religious sacrifices, his devotion to the gods unwavering even as his body failed him. His voice, which had once boomed across battlefields, inspiring men to impossible feats of valor, was reduced to a hoarse whisper. The physicians of Babylon, inheritors of an ancient and respected medical tradition, were powerless. They tried every remedy at their disposal, every poultice, every potion, but nothing could break the fever's grip. The illness was a phantom, an invisible assailant against which their arts were useless. As the days bled into one another, a dreadful realization began to dawn on the court. Alexander was not getting better, he was getting worse. The conqueror of the world was trapped, his body a prison of pain and fire. The decline was a horrifying spectacle, a slow, public unraveling of a man who had been built into a myth. For 11 days, The empire held its breath as its living god was systematically dismantled by an unseen force. The fever, which had begun as a persistent nuisance, escalated into a raging inferno. Alexander's body, once a paradigm of athletic perfection, became a landscape of suffering. He was racked by chills that shook his entire frame, followed by waves of intense heat that left him delirious and drenched in sweat. The abdominal pain, a deep internal agony, never ceased. It was a torment that made it difficult for him to find any position of comfort, forcing him to lie rigid and still for hours on end. As his physical strength ebbed away, his legendary willpower began to fray. The man who had stared down armies and faced death without flinching was now engaged in a desperate, internal battle against his own disintegrating body. The daily rituals, which he had initially insisted on performing, became an impossible ordeal. Soon, he could no longer even be carried to the sacrificial altar. He was confined to his bed, a spectator to his own demise. His mind, the brilliant strategic instrument that had redrawn the map of the world, began to cloud over. Periods of lucidity, where he would discuss the future of the empire with his generals, became shorter and less frequent, interspersed with bouts of delirium. He would murmur the names of his companions, whisper verses from Homer, his thoughts drifting back to the battlefields of his youth. The palace, once a center of vibrant energy and imperial ambition, transformed into a hushed, anxious sick room. The corridors, usually bustling with soldiers and officials, grew quiet, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. The generals, the powerful, ambitious men who had carved out kingdoms at his side, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus, gathered in tense, whispered consultations. They were lions circling a dying lion, their grief for their leader mingled with the cold, calculating fear for their own futures. The question of succession, which had been an abstract, distant concern, was now a terrifyingly immediate reality. Alexander had no clear, legitimate heir. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, but the child's gender was unknown, and its claim to rule a martial empire of Macedonian warlords was tenuous at best. He had an older, illegitimate son, Heracles of Macedon, and a half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, who was considered mentally unfit to rule. The power vacuum he would leave behind would not be a vacuum at all. It would be a vortex, a swirling chaos of ambition and violence that threatened to tear his life's work to pieces. The ordinary soldiers, the men of the phalanx, grew increasingly agitated. They had followed this man to the ends of the earth, had worshipped him as something more than mortal. The idea of his death was inconceivable, a violation of the natural order. They began to suspect foul play. Rumors, like a plague, spread through the ranks. They whispered of poison, of a conspiracy hatched by the resentful Macedonian nobility, or perhaps even by his most trusted generals, men eager to claim a piece of the empire for themselves. They demanded to see their king, to assure themselves that he was still alive. Fearing a riot, the generals relented. In what must be one of history's most poignant and tragic processions, the army was allowed to file past their dying commander. One by one, the hardened veterans, men with scarred faces and calloused hands, walked slowly through the royal bedchamber. They found their king no longer a fearsome warrior, but a wasted figure, emaciated and helpless, his eyes glazed with fever. He was unable to speak, but as they passed, he made a final, heart-wrenching effort. He raised his head slightly, and with a flicker of recognition in his eyes, he acknowledged each man. It was a silent, final farewell between a king and his army, a moment of profound and terrible pathos. The sight of their broken leader shattered the soldiers' morale, replacing their anger with a deep, collective grief. They had seen the truth. The god was dying. The world they knew was about to end. The final hours were a descent into a hell of physical and mental collapse. The fever reached its zenith, and Alexander's body, having exhausted its last reserves of strength, began to shut down. The delirium became almost constant, a fever dream from which he could not escape. His breathing grew shallow and labored, each inhalation a struggle, a rattling sound that echoed in the silent, grief-stricken room. His skin, once bronzed by the suns of a dozen nations, took on a pale, waxy pallor, and his limbs grew cold to the touch. The physicians, having exhausted their arts, could do nothing but watch, helpless witnesses to the final, agonizing act. It was during a brief moment of clarity, as the storm in his mind momentarily subsided, that the most famous and fateful exchange was said to have occurred. His generals, his companions, the men who were about to become his successors and his rivals, gathered around his deathbed. Perdiccas, his senior cavalry commander and trusted friend, leaned in close and asked the question upon which the fate of the world now hung: "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" Alexander's response, whispered through cracked, dry lips, was as ambiguous as it was prophetic. He reportedly uttered two words, toi kratostoi, to the strongest. It was a death sentence for his empire. It was not a designation, but a challenge, a final terrible contest thrown down among his ambitious marshals. It was an invitation to chaos, a prophecy of the bloody wars of succession that would rage for decades, tearing his vast dominion apart. Some later accounts, likely those favorable to Ptolemy's dynasty in Egypt, claimed he had whispered a different name, that he had passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, implying a designated regent. But the story that endured, the one that captured the brutal reality of what was to come, was the declaration that the prize would go to the strongest. It was a quintessentially Macedonian sentiment, a reflection of the ruthless, competitive world from which he and his generals had sprung. Power was not to be inherited, it was to be taken. As the end drew near, his body was racked by convulsions. His throat, constricted by the advancing paralysis, could no longer swallow. A profound and terrifying thirst, a common symptom of the fever, tormented him in his final moments. A cruel irony for a man who had so often indulged in epic bouts of drinking. He was drowning on dry land, his body a furnace, his throat a desert. The man who had conquered the world could not obtain a single drop of water. The final breath was not a peaceful release. It was a surrender, the last shuddering gasp of a body that had been tortured beyond endurance. On the evening of June 10th or 11th, in the year 323 BC, at the age of just 32, Alexander the Great died. The silence that fell in the room was absolute, a profound, deafening void where a monumental life had just been. The king was dead. The god had fallen. The world he had created was instantly orphaned, left to the mercy of the wolves. The immediate aftermath was not one of orderly transition, but of stunned, paralytic fear. For a time, no one knew what to do. The generals stared at the cooling body of their leader, the reality of the situation too immense to fully process. The architect of their fortunes, the center of their universe, was gone. They were adrift in a world of their own making, a world that was now terrifyingly leaderless. The great experiment of a unified Hellenistic empire had died with him. The death of a king is one thing, the death of a god is another. The immediate aftermath in Babylon was a masterclass in political maneuvering and the birth of propaganda. With Alexander's body lying in state, the palace became a hotbed of conspiracy and raw ambition. The first and most pressing problem was the corpse itself. In the searing Babylonian heat, decomposition was an immediate and grotesque concern. Yet, according to the accounts of Plutarch and others, something extraordinary, or perhaps cleverly fabricated, occurred. Alexander's body, they claimed, did not decay. For several days it lay in the sweltering room, yet it showed no signs of putrefaction. It remained pure, lifelike, as if merely sleeping, emitting a sweet, pleasant odor. This was the first piece of posthumous propaganda, a powerful signifier of his divinity. To his followers, it was proof that he was no mere mortal. To his generals, it was a valuable political tool, a way to manage the transition and sanctify their own claims to his legacy. While the body lay in its miraculous state of preservation, the generals began the grim business of carving up the world. The strongest began to test their strength. Perdiccas, holding the king's signet ring, initially took control as regent for Alexander's yet unborn child and his mentally feeble half-brother, Philip Aridaeus. An agreement, the partition of Babylon, was hastily brokered. Ptolemy, shrewd and calculating, chose the ancient and wealthy land of Egypt. Seleucus, another of the leading commanders, would eventually claim the vast eastern territories, founding an empire that would stretch from Syria to India. Antigonus Monophthalmus, or Antigonus the One-Eyed, a veteran commander of Philip II's generation, took control of much of Asia Minor. The fragile peace was doomed from the start. It was a pact made by predators, a temporary truce before the inevitable bloodletting. The fate of Alexander's physical remains became a crucial pawn in their power games. To possess the body of the deified conqueror was to possess a powerful symbol of legitimacy. Perdiccas intended to have the body transported back to the traditional burial ground of Macedonian kings at Aige. But Ptolemy had other plans. In a daring act of political theft, he hijacked the funeral procession. As the magnificent, custom-built funerary cart made its way west, Ptolemy's forces intercepted it and diverted it south, to Egypt. He understood that the tomb of Alexander would be the ultimate religious and political shrine, a pilgrimage site that would consecrate his own rule. The body was first taken to Memphis, the ancient capital of the pharaohs, and later moved to a grand mausoleum in Alexandria, the city that bore the conqueror's name. There, for centuries, the tomb of Alexander the Great would be one of the most famous sites in the ancient world, visited by Roman emperors like Julius Caesar and Augustus, who came to pay homage to their great predecessor. The body itself was eventually placed in a golden sarcophagus, a fitting vessel for the man who had plundered the treasuries of Persia. Meanwhile, the human cost of his death began to mount. His family, the living relics of his bloodline, were systematically and ruthlessly eliminated in the ensuing power struggles. His mother, the formidable and terrifying Olympias, was stoned to death on the orders of Cassander, another of the Diadochi. His wife, Roxana, and his young son, Alexander IV, who was born shortly after his father's death, were imprisoned and eventually murdered, ensuring they could never become a rallying point for loyalists. His illegitimate son, Heracles, met a similar fate. His half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, was executed. Within 15 years of his death, every single member of his immediate royal family was dead. The Argead dynasty, which had ruled Macedon for centuries, was extinguished, its bloodline sacrificed on the altar of his general's ambition. The empire he had bled to create became their battlefield. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, raged for 40 years, a relentless, brutal conflict that pitted friend against friend, army against army. The unity he had envisioned was shattered into a mosaic of warring Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon. These kingdoms would preserve and spread Greek culture, fulfilling a part of his vision, but they would do so in a state of almost constant conflict, a far cry from the harmonious, unified world he had dreamed of. The question that has haunted historians for 2 millennia remains: what killed Alexander the Great? The official cause, as recorded by the court diarists, was a fever. But this simple explanation has never seemed sufficient to account for the dramatic and agonizing nature of his death. The mystery has given rise to countless theories, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. The most sensational and persistent theory is, of course, poison. The idea that Alexander was murdered took root almost immediately among his soldiers and has been debated ever since. The prime suspect in this ancient cold case is often identified as Antipater, the veteran general whom Alexander had left to govern Macedon in his absence. The relationship between the two had soured. Alexander, perhaps paranoid or simply consolidating power, had summoned Antipater to Babylon, a summons that Antipater may have interpreted as a death sentence. The theory posits that Antipater, fearing for his life, conspired with his son, Cassander, to poison the king. The poison, it is said, was a substance of incredible potency, perhaps derived from the river Styx, a mythical waterway in Greece whose waters were said to be lethally toxic. The poison was supposedly delivered to Babylon by Cassander and administered to the king by his royal cupbearer, Iolaus, who was another of Antipater's sons. According to this narrative, the wine given to Alexander by Medius was the delivery mechanism for the fatal dose. This theory, while dramatically compelling, is fraught with problems. The logistics of transporting a notoriously unstable poison thousands of miles, the difficulty of administering it to a king surrounded by loyal attendants, and the 11-day duration of the illness all argue against a simple, fast-acting poison. A slow-acting poison is possible, but identifying a specific substance that matches the described symptoms is nearly impossible with the available evidence. The symptoms themselves: fever, abdominal pain, progressive muscle weakness, and a clear mind, until the very end led modern medical experts to propose a host of alternative diagnoses. One of the most compelling is typhoid fever, a bacterial infection caused by Salmonella typhi, which is spread through contaminated food or water. The symptoms of typhoid, including a sustained high fever, abdominal pain, and a slow, progressive debilitation, are a strong match for the ancient descriptions. Babylon, a crowded, ancient city with questionable sanitation, would have been a fertile breeding ground for such a disease. Another strong contender is malaria. Alexander had spent considerable time in marshy, mosquito-infested regions, and the falciparum malaria common in the area can be deadly. The cyclical fevers and chills are characteristic of the disease, although the acute abdominal pain is less typical. West Nile virus, another mosquito-borne illness, has also been suggested. Its symptoms can include fever, paralysis, and encephalitis, which could account for the final delirium. A more obscure but fascinating theory points to pancreatitis, an inflammation of the pancreas, which can be triggered by excessive alcohol consumption. A severe bout of acute pancreatitis would certainly explain the sudden, excruciating abdominal pain Alexander experienced after his night of heavy drinking. It can also lead to fever, systemic collapse, and death, fitting the narrative remarkably well. Then there is the intriguing possibility of Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune disorder where the body's immune system mistakenly attacks the nerves. This could have been triggered by an infection, such as from Campylobacter pylori. This diagnosis is particularly interesting because it can cause a progressive, ascending paralysis while leaving the patient's mind clear. This would explain why Alexander became unable to move or speak, but could still acknowledge his soldiers. It would also explain the most curious detail of all: the alleged non-decomposition of his body. A patient with Guillain-Barré syndrome can experience such a profound paralysis and a slowing of their breathing that they may be mistakenly declared dead while still, in fact, being alive. If Alexander was not truly dead, but in a deep, paralytic state, it would account for the lack of immediate putrefaction. He may have been, in a final, unimaginable horror, entombed while still conscious. Ultimately, the precise cause of Alexander's death is a mystery that will likely never be solved. The historical evidence is too thin, filtered through the biased accounts of later writers, each with their own agenda. The medical diagnoses are speculative, fascinating exercises in retrospective pathology, but impossible to prove. Yet, the true significance of his death lies not in the what, but in the what if. His demise at the age of 32 is one of history's greatest turning points. He died at the very moment he was transitioning from conqueror to ruler, from a brilliant general to a visionary statesman. His plans were breathtaking in their ambition. He was preparing for the conquest of the Arabian Peninsula, which would have secured vital trade routes. He was planning the circumnavigation and conquest of Africa. There were whispers of a campaign westward, towards Carthage, and the rising power of Rome. Had he lived another 20 or 30 years, the world we know today might be unrecognizably different. A stable, unified Hellenistic empire stretching from Italy to India could have prevented the rise of Rome, or at least dramatically altered its trajectory. The cultural synthesis of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions, which he had so forcefully championed, would have had generations to mature, potentially creating a global civilization centuries ahead of its time. The spread of scientific knowledge from the libraries of Alexandria and the astronomical schools of Babylon could have accelerated human progress in ways we can only imagine, but it was not to be. His death was not just the end of a man, it was the shattering of a dream. The world he left behind was not one of unity, but of division. His legacy was not peace, but decades of savage warfare fought by the very men he had led to glory. The story of Alexander's death is therefore a profound and timeless tragedy. It is a story about the fragility of genius, the capriciousness of fate, and the terrifying void that can be left by the absence of a single, irreplaceable individual. It demonstrates how even the most powerful person on earth, a man who commanded vast armies and was worshipped as a god, could be brought down by something as small and mundane as a bacterium, a mosquito, or a single cup of poisoned wine. It is a stark reminder of the limitations of human power in the face of nature and our own mortality. His body, which had been a vessel for such boundless ambition, became in the end just a piece of flesh, subject to the same laws of decay and dissolution as any other. The horror of his death is not just in the physical agony he endured, the fever, the pain, the paralysis. It is in the colossal, world-altering waste of it all. The library of his plans burned with his final fever. The empire he built was the funeral pyre for his dynasty. He conquered the world, only to have it crumble into dust the moment he departed from it. The tale of Alexander's final days serves as a grotesque but powerful metaphor for the nature of power itself. His suffering was a mirror to the state of his empire. His body, once a symbol of unity and strength, became a battleground for warring forces, just as his empire would become a battleground for his warring generals. The internal fire of the fever consumed him from within, a parallel to the internal resentments and ambitions that were about to consume his life's work. The paralysis that crept over his limbs mirrored the political paralysis that gripped his court, the inability to name a successor, the failure to secure the future. His death was the ultimate act of deconstruction. It stripped away the layers of myth, divinity, and legend to reveal the vulnerable, mortal man beneath. It was a visceral lesson in the ultimate democracy of death, the great equalizer that comes for kings and commoners alike. The man who had sought to reach the ends of the earth and touch the face of the gods found his own end in a sweltering room, his world shrinking to the confines of a sweat-soaked bed. The symbolism is inescapable. He who had inflicted so much death and destruction upon the world, who had presided over the slaughter of tens of thousands at cities like Tyre and Gaza, was himself subjected to a slow, torturous, and ignominious end. There is a dark, poetic justice in the narrative, a sense that the violence he had unleashed upon the world had finally turned inward, devouring its creator. His legacy is therefore profoundly dualistic. He was both a unifier and a destroyer, a visionary and a tyrant, a spreader of culture and an agent of immense suffering. He was a man who dreamed of a world without borders, yet his death ensured that new, more violent borders would be drawn in blood. He is remembered as the Great, a title bestowed by the Romans who admired his military genius. But for the countless thousands who died resisting his advance, for the families extinguished in the wars that followed his death, his greatness was a terrifying, destructive force. The horror of his death is compounded by the horror of what followed. The wars of the Diadochi were a maelstrom of violence that destabilized the region for generations. The dream of a cosmopolitan world order gave way to the brutal reality of Hellenistic power politics, where kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of their pike phalanxes and the cunning of their kings. The hope for a new era of peace and cooperation was lost in a storm of ambition. Alexander's story is a cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of concentrated power and the folly of believing that any single individual can contain the chaotic forces of history. He built an empire that was entirely dependent on his own personal genius, his own charisma, his own driving force. He was the linchpin that held the entire structure together, and when that linchpin was removed, the structure inevitably collapsed into ruin. In the end, Alexander's death forces us to confront the most fundamental questions of human existence. What is the meaning of a life, even one lived on such a colossal scale, if its creations are so ephemeral? What is the nature of greatness, and is it a force for good or for destruction? His story resonates through the ages because it is our story, writ large. It is the story of ambition and its limits, of the eternal struggle between our grand designs and the messy, unpredictable reality of the world. He is the ultimate archetype of the tragic hero, the man who flew too close to the sun and was consumed by its fire. The image of him in his final days, helpless and delirious, is a haunting memento mori for all of humanity. It reminds us that beneath the crowns, the titles, and the monuments, we are all fragile beings, subject to the same biological imperatives. The man who sought immortality through glorious deeds ultimately found it in the mystery and tragedy of his death. The endless debate over how he died ensures that he will never be forgotten. The story of his agonizing end has become as much a part of his legend as the victories at Issus and Gaugamela. It is the final, dark chapter that gives his life its profound and unsettling power. It transforms him from a simple historical figure into a timeless symbol of human potential and human vulnerability, a ghost who haunts the corridors of history, forever whispering his final, fateful challenge to all who would follow. The world belongs to the strongest. The horror of his death is not just that he died, but that in doing so, he revealed the terrible, fragile truth of all human endeavor. The legacy of Alexander's agonizing end is not written in stone, but in the very fabric of the world that followed. The Hellenistic era, born from the wreckage of his empire, was a direct consequence of his inability to secure a peaceful succession. The kingdoms of the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids became centers of Greek culture, science, and art, spreading Hellenism far and wide. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the great library and the museum, where scholars like Euclid and Eratosthenes made groundbreaking discoveries. This flowering of culture was part of Alexander's dream, but it came at the cost of his unified vision. It was a fragmented legacy, a collection of brilliant shards from a shattered mirror. The political landscape he left behind also paved the way for the rise of Rome. The endless infighting among the Hellenistic kingdoms weakened them, making them ripe for conquest by the disciplined and organized legions from the west. One by one, the successor states fell under Roman influence and were eventually absorbed into the Roman Empire. Rome, in many ways, became the true successor to Alexander, achieving the political stability and longevity that had eluded him. The Romans were both fascinated and haunted by his memory. They studied his tactics, emulated his ambition, and made pilgrimages to his tomb. He was the benchmark against which they measured their own emperors, the ghost of greatness they perpetually chased. The mystery surrounding his death also had a profound impact on the practice of history itself. The conflicting accounts, the rumors of poison, the competing narratives pushed by the successor kingdoms, all of this forced later historians to become critical evaluators of evidence. The story of his death is a case study in how history is written by the victors, how propaganda can shape the truth, and how the character of a great figure can be contested for centuries. The search for the cause of his death is, in a way, a search for a coherent narrative, an attempt to impose order on a chaotic and ambiguous event. It reflects a deep human need for answers, for closure, for a clear line between cause and effect. But history rarely offers such simple comforts. The truth of Alexander's end is likely a messy combination of factors: a lifetime of extreme physical exertion, numerous battle wounds, a penchant for heavy drinking, and an unlucky encounter with an infectious disease in a city with poor sanitation. The mundane reality is perhaps more terrifying than any conspiracy. It suggests that history is not always driven by grand plots and heroic actions, but often by chance, by accident, by the microscopic organisms that are the true, silent rulers of the world. The horror, then, is not just personal, but existential. It is the horror of realizing that the course of civilization can be altered by a microbe, that the grandest of human ambitions can be undone by a moment of biological misfortune. Alexander the Great, the man who wanted to be a god, was ultimately reminded, in the most brutal way imaginable, that he was merely a man. And in that terrible final lesson lies his most enduring and unsettling legacy.